The senator from New Hampshire is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you. I had intended to come to the floor earlier today with Senator Grassley so that we could talk about our legislation that we are introducing this week that would build upon our efforts to protect the survivors of sexual assault in the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, I got delayed, but Senator Grassley was here on the floor, and I just want to recognize all of his efforts to address this critical issue and appreciate again his willingness to work with me. The effort to extend rights for sexual assault survivors across the country is critically important, and I'm hopeful that when the bill that we've introduced gets to the floor, that all of our colleagues will join us in passing this bipartisan legislation. I first became involved in the precursor to this legislation in 2015 when a young woman named Amanda Nguyen of the RISE organization contacted my office. She'd been traveling from office to office here in the Senate, trying to find somebody to listen to her story. Amanda is a survivor of sexual assault, and she is a fierce advocate for change in the way our criminal justice system treats survivors. When she detailed her harrowing story of sexual assault and subsequent interactions with the criminal justice system, it was very clear that something had to change. Amanda described a system that further traumatized survivors and provided scarce protection for their rights. Evidence of assaults was being destroyed without survivors even knowing about it, and survivors were forced to periodically follow up with law enforcement to preserve evidence of their assaults. The broken process that survivors were forced to endure resulted in a system where they were often re-victimized. This system forced survivors to confront the trauma of reliving their attacks each time they sought to preserve evidence or gather information about their cases. Working with Amanda, I introduced the Sexual Assault Survivors' Rights Act to ensure survivors were guaranteed basic rights while pursuing justice. The legislation created the first legally recognized set of rights for survivors to enforce in a court of law. And I'm so grateful that Senator Grassley worked on this effort with me, and he included the legislation in the Adam Walsh Reauthorization Act so that it could be signed into law. The legislation that we passed back in 2015 and 2016 provided survivors with greater protections in federal cases with a focus on notice, access, and the preservation of sexual assault evidence collection kits. By creating this set of court-enforceable rights at the federal level, Congress established a model for all states to adopt similar legislation to protect the rights of survivors. And that's happened in many states, including in my home state of New Hampshire. States have adopted legislation to guarantee survivors certain basic rights in the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, we have a lot of other states that have not followed suit and don't have legislation that protects survivors. That's why the bill that Senator Grassley and I came to the floor today to discuss is just so important. The Survivors' Bill of Rights in the States Act would establish a grant program accessible to states that have in place a law which guarantees the rights contained in the Sexual Assault Survivors' Rights Act. States could then use the funds to implement survivor rights, preserve sexual assault evidence collection kits, reduce the backlog of kits, and provide support for victim services. Now is the time to pass this legislation. The risk of sexual assault and domestic violence has increased during this coronavirus pandemic. We can look at any of the statistics and they show us that. We need to ensure that states provide the same level of protection for these survivors as they receive at the federal level. No survivor should be compelled to bear the indignity of petitioning law enforcement merely to ensure that they're given a fair shake in the criminal justice process. It's my hope that this legislation will lead to an increase in states passing bills that protect survivors' rights. Let's again show survivors that Congress is behind them and that we will stand up for their rights. Let's pass the Survivors' Bill of Rights in the States Act. Again, I want to thank Senator Grassley for all of his efforts, and I hope that together, with the support of other sponsors in this body, that we can get this bill across the finish line. Thank you very much, Mr. President.